Welcome to Geo Wars Explained, where every war is not just a story. Disclaimer: this channel provides commentary and analysis on historical and crumps.
This island was the most profitable colony on Earth. It was also about to destroy the greatest army in the world.
700,000 people. No army, no navy, no treasury, no government recognized by anyone. This was the finest army on Earth. They had broken Austria, humiliated Prussia, crossed...
The island was already dying before the first musket fired. Saint-Domingue in 1791 was the most profitable colony on Earth, producing nearly half of Europe's sugar and a third of its coffee. It was also a pressure vessel. 700,000 enslaved people labored under a system so brutal that the colony consumed its own labor force faster than ships could replenish it. The French plantation economy was not a stable machine. It was a controlled explosion, and the people holding it together had already lost control of the fuse. Here is the question that most accounts never ask properly. How did an enslaved population, with no professional army, no navy, no treasury, and no recognized government, defeat the most battle-hardened European military power of its era? Napoleon's France had just humiliated Austria, Prussia, and Egypt. His generals had marched across continents. His army was the finest in the world by any measurable standard. And yet, in a Caribbean island smaller than the state of Maryland, that army was broken permanently. The answer is not found in any single battle. It is found in the architecture of the situation itself. The first layer of this architecture is economic, and it is the one most historians skip too quickly. Saint-Domingue was not simply valuable to France, it was structurally irreplaceable. By 1800, the colony generated more revenue than all of France's other overseas territories combined. That dependency created a specific kind of blindness in Paris. French policymakers could not afford to imagine the colony as anything other than a production system. Every decision that Napoleon made about Saint-Domingue was filtered through that lens, to including the decision to send an army in 1801. The goal was never to crush a rebellion in the abstract sense. The goal was to restore a revenue stream. That distinction determined everything. When you send an army to restore a labor system, you are not sending it to win a war in the conventional sense. You are sending it to achieve an administrative outcome by military means. General Charles Leclerc arrived in early 1802 with approximately 20,000 soldiers, the largest French expeditionary force ever sent to the Western Hemisphere. His orders were not simply to defeat Toussaint Louverture's forces in the field. His orders were to pacify the territory, re-establish French authority, and prepare the ground for the re-imposition of slavery, which Napoleon had quietly decided to restore. Those two objectives, military victory and labor system restoration, were not complementary. They were structurally incompatible. An army that pacifies a population by force creates exactly the conditions that make that population impossible to exploit economically. Geography then introduced its own constraint, and it did so with absolute consistency. Saint-Domingue is not a flat Caribbean island. The interior is dominated by mountain ranges that rise above 2,000 meters. The roads, such as they were, followed river valleys and coastal paths that were easily observed and easily blocked. French columns moving into the interior were predictable. The defenders were not. Louverture's forces, and later those commanded by Jean-Jacques Dessalines and Henri Christophe, understood the terrain in a way no European officer could replicate from a map. They knew which ridgelines channeled movement, which river crossings were reliable in the wet season, and which settlements could serve as supply points invisible to coastal patrols. Geographic knowledge is a military asset. In Saint-Domingue, it belonged entirely to one side. The mountain terrain did something more than complicate French movement. It made the French logistical system unsustainable at scale. An army in the field consumes food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement soldiers at a constant rate. In Europe, that consumption could be managed through an established network of roads, depots, and local procurement. In Saint-Domingue's interior, none of those systems existed in the form Leclerc expected. The plantation economy had never required a military supply network because it had never anticipated a military campaign against the people living within it. The French army had arrived to restore a system that had been designed for peace. It now had to conduct war using infrastructure built for commerce. Then came the biological constraint, and it was the most decisive of all. Yellow fever is endemic to the Caribbean lowlands. European soldiers arriving from temperate climates had no acquired immunity. The disease did not discriminate by rank or valor. It killed privates and generals with equal indifference. Leclerc himself died of yellow fever in November 1802. His replacement, Donatien Rochambeau, watched his effective strength collapse month by month as disease outpaced any capacity to reinforce. Estimates vary by source, but the consensus among military historians is that French forces lost somewhere between 40 and 50,000 men in Saint-Domingue between 1802 and 1803. The majority of those deaths were not battlefield casualties, they were medical ones. The army was not being defeated by tactics alone. It was being dissolved by an environment it could not adapt to and had not prepared for. The defenders had a fundamentally different relationship with that same environment. The formerly enslaved population of Saint-Domingue had lived in that disease landscape for generations. Many had survived yellow fever exposure in childhood, the period during which the body builds lasting immunity if the patient survives. Those who reached adulthood in the colony carried a biological advantage that no European reinforcement could acquire quickly enough to matter. This was not a planned military strategy. It was a structural asymmetry built into the population itself, over decades of forced labor and forced migration. The same system that had brought enslaved Africans to Saint-Domingue and killed enormous numbers of them in the process had inadvertently produced a surviving population with a biological resilience that a European expeditionary force simply could not match. The political situation in Europe then introduced a constraint of its own that operated entirely outside Saint-Domingue's geography. By 1803, Britain and France had resumed open hostilities following the brief Peace of Amiens. The Royal Navy reasserted its dominance of Atlantic shipping lanes. French resupply convoys to Saint-Domingue became unreliable, then dangerous, then effectively impossible at the scale the campaign required. Rochambeau needed tens of thousands of replacement soldiers and sustained logistical support to maintain any realistic hope of reconquest. The British blockade ensured those reinforcements either arrived in insufficient numbers or did not arrive at all. A military campaign that depended on sea lanes it did not control was a campaign with a structural ceiling. That ceiling had been reached. Napoleon's strategic calculations then shifted in response to the European situation, and that shift had a direct consequence for Saint-Domingue. With Britain hostile, the Atlantic increasingly contested, and France's financial position under strain, the broader vision of a French empire in the Western Hemisphere became strategically untenable. Louisiana, which Napoleon had acquired from Spain in 1800 with the intention of building a continental American supply base for Caribbean colonies, now represented an exposed liability rather than a strategic asset. Without Saint-Domingue as the economic engine of that system, there was no system. Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States in April 1803. The decision acknowledged what the situation on the island had already demonstrated. The project was over. France's presence in the Western Hemisphere was contracting, not so expanding, and no military outcome in Saint-Domingue could reverse that direction. The commanders on the ground in Saint-Domingue understood something before Paris fully accepted it. Rochambeau had shifted strategy from pacification to suppression, employing increasingly severe measures against the civilian population in an attempt to break the insurgency through terror rather than military defeat. That shift was itself a symptom of strategic bankruptcy. When a military force abandons the goal of winning the population's acquiescence and instead pursues its destruction, it signals that the administrative goal, restoring a functional labor system, has been abandoned. You cannot enslave a population you are simultaneously trying to exterminate. Rochambeau's methods foreclosed the economic outcome the campaign had been designed to achieve. The military strategy and the political objective had become mutually exclusive. The final constraint was the one that made all the others irreversible. By late 1803, the forces under Dessalines had consolidated control of the interior at a level that left French forces confined to coastal enclaves. Those enclaves could be supplied barely by sea, but they could not be expanded. The French military presence had been reduced to a static defensive posture in ports that no longer served any strategic purpose. They held the docks of a colony they no longer controlled. On November 18, 1803, at the Battle of Vertières, the last significant French force was defeated. Rochambeau surrendered to British naval commanders rather than to the Haitian forces, a choice that reflected the complete inversion of the situation from 2 years earlier. The army that had arrived to restore order was now seeking protection from the people it had come to subjugate. Haiti declared independence on January 1, 1804. Dessalines named the new state using the indigenous Taino word for the island, a deliberate erasure of the French colonial name. The declaration was not simply a political act, it was the formal acknowledgement of an outcome that the structural conditions had been producing for at least 18 months before the document was signed. The constraints had accumulated in sequence. The economic dependency of France had distorted its strategic judgment. The terrain had negated European tactical advantages. The disease environment had consumed irreplaceable military manpower. The British naval presence had severed the logistical lifeline. The shift to atrocity had destroyed the administrative rationale for the campaign. Each constraint alone would have imposed costs. Stacked together, they produced an outcome from which no tactical adjustment could have rescued the French position. What the Haitian Revolution demonstrated was not the triumph of will over power, though that narrative has its appeal. What it demonstrated was the operation of multiple structural systems simultaneously, none of which Napoleon's staff fully modeled before committing to the campaign. The colony was analyzed as an economic asset to be recovered. It should have been analyzed as a military theater with specific constraints. Those constraints were present from the beginning. They were not created by the resistance. The mountain terrain had always been there. Yellow fever had always been endemic. Just the Atlantic had always been dominated by whichever European power controlled the sea lanes. The formerly enslaved population had always carried the immunological history of its survival. The campaign failed not because the French army was outfought at every engagement, though it sustained consistent losses, but because the environment in which it was fighting was incompatible with its objectives at a systemic level. The system did not allow for the outcome France sought. And systems in the end are not moved by ambition.